manager. We're running a blended event today, so I'm really delighted that we've got Steve Illingworth in the library, in the Nalgo room, talking today. I'm trying to host from home because I've got COVID, so I've not been able to come into the library to do it as I wanted to. So thank you all for bearing with us while we do this sort of three-way strange blended event. So apologies in advance if there's any technical problems. I know that Steve is a long-time friend of the library, and he's done a lot of work for the library in the past around the library's learning resources. But today he's looking at the Women's Cooperative Guild, and his talk is about applied pacifism, a fresh look at the role of the Women's Cooperative Guild during World War II. I'm not going to say too much. I'm feeling quite fluey, so I'm going to hand over to Steve, and hopefully he will take over, and we will leave some time at the end for some questions as well. So I'm going to put myself on mute while Steve is presenting, and hopefully the sound quality will be okay. Thanks, Steve.
Right, thanks, Belinda. If I can also thank Lindsay and Jane in the actually here in the library in Salford, who've also been very helpful in getting everything set up today in the circumstances, so that we can have this event both in person at the library here, where we have a few people in front of me, and also online as well. They also very kindly managed to find something which allowed me to stand up to present, which is more of the way I like to do things rather than to sit down too. So thanks to Lindsay and Jane at this end for what they've done already today. Right, so today's talk, as you can see, called Applied Pacifism. That's based on a phrase used by one of the leaders of the Women's Cooperative Guild, and I think it kind of sums up really the position of the Guild back in the 1940s, as we'll see. And I've subtitled it A Fresh Look at the Role of the Women's Cooperative Guild in World War II. And I think it's a fresh look because existing literature about the Women's Cooperative Guild in the 1940s, I think has underestimated the important part they played in World War II. And my research has suggested that there's more to the story than other people have led us to believe. So that's why I think it's going to be a fresh look, and to really highlight, I think, the important role that the Guild played, both in terms of the theory of their pacifism, but also the practical work that they did as well during the 1940s. Obviously, Women's Cooperative Guild is a bit of a mouthful. It's either 7 or 8 syllables, depending on whether you pronounce it as cooperative or cooperative. So occasionally I'll refer to it as WCG or the Guild, just for a brevity there. Bit of background really about how I came to be interested in this, just talking to 1 or 2 people in the actual audience here, and they were asking me if I had any links to the Guild. Well, I don't really, but it's just something I've stumbled across really in the last couple of years or so. Previously, I've done quite a bit of work on pacifism and conscientious objectors in World War I, and particularly with the Working Class Movement Library here as well. My background is in education, as teaching, educational consultant and teacher training. I still do a bit of teacher training now, but that's just part-time. So I've got more time now to do some research on some real history, which I'm very much enjoying at the moment. So a few years ago, when I was working as an educational consultant, I worked with the Working Class Movement Library on the James Hudson project, which some of you will be aware of. James Hudson was a First World War Salford conscientious objector, and he went to prison, and his story was put together by the library in the form of a play. They commissioned someone to write a play about it, and this was performed in the library and in other locations as well. And I helped out by producing the educational resources that went alongside that play. So that got me into World War I conscientious objectors. And then last June, I did an online talk for the library on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock like this. And that was on the subject of prison disturbances at Wandsworth in London involving conscientious objectors. And then since then, I've got more interested in, well, what happened to these people when it came to World War II? Was there a similar degree of pacifism as there had been in World War I? It had probably always been my assumption that maybe there wasn't. That in some ways World War II might have been seen by more people as a kind of just war, a war which was justified, because we were fighting against Nazi Germany. However, I found that pacifism was very strong in World War II as well. So there has been some academic work done by historians on pacifism in World War II, but very little has been done on women's pacifism in particular, and even more specifically, on working class women's pacifism as well. So my research has suggested that there's an untold story here, which I want to share with you this afternoon. So I've been using the archive sources, some of which were based at the library here in Salford, and many of which were also based at the Cooperative Heritage Centre in Manchester. That's at Hollyoake House near Victoria Station, where they have lots of resources, particularly the cooperative news journals, a weekly journal published by the Cooperative Society, which shed quite a bit of light on this topic for me. And also, I think in this respect as well, I'm interested in this as almost a way of challenging some sort of gender stereotypes. In the academic history world, there's concern that most of when it comes to histories of wars, and particularly the 20th century world wars, that it's mainly the male historians who are writing about the military side, about the battles, and it's the female historians who tend to focus more on the social side, what was happening on the home front. And I think that's probably not a desirable situation to have. So I see it as my role here, partly as a man, to delve into the women's history to try and sort of pierce those stereotypes a little bit. Enough about me. Let's move on to the main topic now in terms of the Women's Cooperative Guild and a bit of background. Some of you will know a lot about this already. And one lady in the audience was talking about her mother being a prominent member of the Guild back in the 1940s as well. So part of a wider cooperative movement, which, as I'm sure many of you know, started in 1844 in Rochdale, not far from here. And particularly for those of us who've lived in the late 20th century and early 21st century, the cooperative movement perhaps manifests itself mainly through the co-op stores, through the co-op shops, with the principle there, certainly historically, that there were no private shareholders. All the profits were then ploughed back into the customers who gained dividends, which they could then spend in the shops and elsewhere. So the whole cooperative movement then is about not sort of competing with each other, but with businesses cooperating together, sharing out the profits to provide good quality, affordable food, particularly for the working classes of this country. So that was in the 1840s when the co-op movement was founded. Then about 40 years later, in 1883, we then have the Women's Cooperative movement starting as a Women's Cooperative Guild. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Guild had 87,000 members, mainly working class women. Sometimes the leadership of the Guild came from a slightly more educated, privileged background. People who've been to university, for example, whereas most of the members of the Guild would have left school at 14, 15 and become either housewives or worked in factories, etc. However, in the period we're looking at in the 1940s, the main leader of the Guild was Cecily Cook, who did come from a very humble background, as did most of the membership as well. They called themselves the Trade Union for Mothers. They saw that their role was as mothers who were the principal people involved shopping in the household, but it was their duty to make sure there was good quality, available, affordable food, particularly, and so the Guild was very influential in forming policy, forming the sort of food policy or the food distribution policy of the cooperative movement in general. And then from the 1930s, the Guild became involved in kind of wider political activities, and it was they that introduced the white poppy in 1933. I'm sure you're aware of the background of the white poppy, and I know in the library here it's something which is very much promoted. So, being pacifists from the 1930s onwards, the Guild had the idea that they felt that maybe the red poppy, in their view, had a little bit too much association with the military, and they wanted a different kind of poppy, which still helped us to remember the people who died in wars, but tried to get across more strongly the message that war should not exist at all, and that in future that we should have peace. So that was a big thing in the 1930s. Looking at this slide, I think most historians would agree with every single bullet point on there, as a matter of fact, apart from possibly the last one, which is more my view based on the research I've done. Because many historians seem to then assume that the Guild lost its pacifist way during the 1940s, and a lot of the members maybe started to actively support the war and come round to that kind of view. My view is that on the whole, although there were individual members who had different views, the Guild as an organisation did stay strongly pacifist, and I'll explain that as we go through. Interestingly, the wider cooperative movement was not pacifist in World War II. They supported the war. So alongside the Parliamentary Labour Party, for example, certainly from 1940 onwards, when Churchill became Prime Minister, they started to actively support the war effort. So you do have many members of the Labour Party, Herbert Morrison, Clement Attlee, Ellen Wilkinson, for example, who were part of Churchill's war cabinet. And a lot of the cooperative movement, who generally speaking had association with the Labour Party, then moved towards that position of supporting the war from about 1940 onwards. But the Women's Guild did not. You know, they kept their distinct pacifism, and we'll see what that consists of now. You might assume that a group who called themselves the Trade Union for Mothers might base their pacifism on a distinct maternal view of the world. And if we go back to World War I, we do see that many women pacifists, not necessarily members of the Guild on this occasion, did actually voice their pacifism through this kind of maternal lens. And here's a few quotations there. And I say none of these people, to my knowledge, actually were members of the Guild, but they're showing the kind of views which prevailed amongst women in the World War I era, first of all. So you can see there, they're pretty much saying, like Olive Schreiner there is saying that women, because they have the burden of childbearing, they know what human flesh is all about, you know, so they don't want to waste it in terms of warfare. Too long has the mother heart of woman suffered in silence, the Dutch pacifist Jacobs saying there. Catherine Marshall, war was an outrage on motherhood. Helena Swanwick, war was a silly bloody game of massacring sons of women. Very much that maternal angle here. Incidentally, the WILPF mentioned there for the bottom two people, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, largely fairly privileged, intellectual, educated women who could afford to go to conferences on the continent, even during World War I. So not members of the Guild, but very much having that kind of idea in World War I. Now, my research has suggested that by World War II, there was a different outlook and a different strand to the pacifism. And like I said here, you might expect that a group called the Trade Union for Mothers would have that maternal angle on things. But when the Women's Guild did actually voice its pacifism, it was very much based on political cooperative principles. Basically speaking, they believed that cooperation was all about economic cooperation between businesses, between nations, rather than competing with each other like capitalists do. And so they then felt that economic cooperation should automatically lead to political cooperation. Therefore, no wars, no need for any wars. That's the basis of it. And you can see that in the two quotations here. First of all, a previous General Secretary, very influential, Margaret Llewellyn Davis, probably the best known of all the General Secretaries of the Guild. And her ideas, were still very strong by the 1940s. This idea of a brotherhood of nations, we're cooperating together with trade and industry. Therefore, we shouldn't be in conflict, that kind of idea. And then after the war had broken out in February 1940, the Women's Cooperative Guild conference there proclaimed that they didn't like the British government's war aims. As far as they were concerned, the British government was just trying to protect the British Empire and to protect capitalism across the world. So again, the Guild by the 1940s, not thinking about themselves as mothers protecting their children in terms of warfare, but very much based more on this economic argument, which is quite an interesting one. And it's something I'm still exploring in my research as to why there is that kind of change, which I don't want to go into now. I want to try to put this into a kind of wider context as well, excuse me, in terms of Britain as a whole during World War II. I'm sure you'd agree that when we look back to World War II, we do think of it as a time of great national unity and consensus that, generally speaking, nearly all the population are involved in wanting to win the war against, the evils of Nazi Germany. And phrases like the spirit of the Blitz, Dunkirk spirit, used at the time and still used today. And I noticed, during the recent pandemic, often politicians and the media would refer to this as well. As a country, we all need to pull together. We need to make sacrifices for the greater good. And those phrases have come back again as well. And of course, sadly, in the current situation with Ukraine as well, we've seen a situation where, again, Ukrainian people, their struggle has been likened often to the struggle of Britain, during 1940 and 1941 as well. So this still resonates, in modern day politics with all of us. The historian's angle, Sonia Rose, she summed it up quite well, I think, in terms of what the popular memory is in this country, of World War II was a historical moment when the nation was truly united. Robert Mackay agrees with this. He writes a book called The Test of War. And according to him, what the test of war above all revealed about Britain was that it was a cohesive society. Usually historians try to find exceptions and try to challenge the sort of consensus, but he's actually saying there, well, yes, Britain did pull together in the war. And Angus Calder reckons that in 1940-1941, the country showed some signs of division, but after that, national unity prevailed again. So that very strong view there of people pulling together, and you can see the illustration on there of a kind of underground shelter and people having a Christmas party and all being very jolly despite the circumstances. Now, of course, if I'm right, and if we do have tens of thousands of members of a women's cooperative guild who are not in favour of the war, then this challenges this consensus view to some extent at least. And to be fair, historians have recognised that there was opposition to the war in Britain, during the 1940s, but they've tended to concentrate on groups like this, the Peace Pledge Union, a group in the 1930s who signed a pledge to renounce all forms of war. And they're still going strong in the 1940s, but they do tend to fade away and get a bit sort of confused and divided. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, as I'm sure you know, since the 17th century, have been pacifist. And they do play a big part in humanitarian work during the war, supporting the victims of war, both in Britain and abroad, but without supporting the war itself. And there's been quite a lot written about the Quakers, the Friends Ambulance Service, the Friends Relief Service, etc. The Women's International League that I mentioned before, again, because those kind of women were often educated, well connected, what they wrote and what they said was often recorded. And so historians have got that record, more so than they have of, say, ordinary guild members. And then we have educated writers, Vera Britton, Testament of Youth, talking about her experiences of the First World War, massive selling book in the 1920s, 1930s. She's also the mother of Shirley Williams, who was a Labour politician in the 1970s, one of the founders of the SDP in the 1980s. You can see some members of the audience shaking their heads and tutting there, but we'll leave that one for now. And then we've got Virginia Woolf, very famous author, also a pacifist, and of course she wrote lots about this, and that's been quoted. And then perhaps a lesser known person, but somebody who was like the first person I read about this topic, Frances Partridge, who was also like a friend of Virginia Woolf and part of that kind of Bloomsbury intellectual set. Now, this might seem like a bit of a diversion away from the Guild, but it's a point I want to make, that when you read anything about World War II pacifism, it's people like Francis Partridge who get quoted rather than members of the Guild. And Francis Partridge's book was called A Pacifist Diary. So it sounds really definitive, doesn't it? You know, like this is the diary of a typical pacifist. And it was indeed the first book I read on this topic. So she's a writer and reviewer, and she lived in a cottage in a remote part of Wiltshire. And the diary is full of discussions with her fellow intellectuals who come round for tea, and that's actually a picture of her garden there in Wiltshire. Lavish meals in the West End of London, you know, while most of us were trying to get through on rations at the time. And her problem of having to do her own housework because her housemaid had the audacity to go and leave and work in a factory because she wanted to support the war effort. Okay, so you can imagine that didn't go down too well. And Virginia Nicholson, a modern writer, refers to Partridge's set as a little fortress occupied by dissenters reading the New Statesman, a kind of left-leaning paper. So that's the kind of impression we can get of pacifists in World War II, but they're slightly on the margin, slightly remote, and possibly slightly elitist in their kind of outlook there. Which is why I think it is important then that we don't neglect the Women's Cooperative Guild. And yet, you know, most of the main historical works on this period have done so to a large extent. So the main two books, both written in the 1980s on World War II pacifism, were written by Martin Keedle, I'm going to pronounce that, and Rachel Barker. Martin Keedle doesn't really mention the Women's Guild at all. You know, there's perhaps a passing mention in a list, but he doesn't talk about them. Rachel Barker makes just one mention where she's listing various groups who helped conscientious objectors. Jill Liddington, a very quite well-known feminist historian, she wrote a book which traced the link between feminism and pacifism from the 19th century through to the 1980s. She does mention the Guild on several occasions, but not in the World War II period. She finishes one chapter at 1939, and the next chapter starts at 1954. So again, you know, it seems an odd kind of omission in some ways. And then a historian called Gillian Scott, she's written perhaps the most detailed academic book about the Guild, but then she even stops abruptly at 1939, and does almost then just dismisses the World War II time as one of confusion and inaction amongst the Guild, and just kind of ignores it and stops abruptly. So, aiming to plug this gap, I'm looking particularly at you know, various primary sources, and most of these can be found, as I mentioned before, in the Cooperative Heritage Archive in Manchester. And particularly, there's a few minute books there of various kind of local guild meetings. But I think more importantly, what I found really useful was the Cooperative News Journal coming out once a week. And 2 whole pages in there would be devoted to the Women's Guild itself. Now, you might think, well, okay, is that a fairly biased source? Is the main journal for the cooperative movement going to build up and maybe highlight the strengths of the Women's Cooperative Guild and to insist that they were a consistent organisation, etc.? So that's why I put that second bullet point there. The journal includes a range of views in its letters pages, and indeed when it's reported on conferences that have happened, it does mention that the leadership has not always been supported, that occasionally there were members who wanted to overturn the leadership's views on certain things, including on their pacifism. So I think that does show that the journal's a good source to use because it does have that wide range of views, but certainly overall it suggests that there was a consistent policy from the leadership of maintaining that pacifism. And my suggestion is that, you know, historians need to move beyond the traditional archives in the National Archives and the British Library in London. I've been there. I've been to both those places in the last few months, you know, to do my research. But looking towards Salford and Manchester is also important, you know, for what we can find up here as well. And so this is what, to me, the archives show about what the Women's Cooperative Guild achieved, during World War II. So they were involved very strongly in humanitarian work in Britain. I'm going to pronounce the name at the top as Rydalsh. Apologies if it's nothing like that, but Mrs. Rydalsh. She's the person who was given us the title for this talk, Applied Pacifism. And I think she talks that real cooperation, in other words, the values of this movement, are all about applied pacifism, pacifism in practice. And some of the practical things that the Guild did are listed there. So entertainment and comfort for wounded soldiers, helping evacuated families, and providing facilities for people sheltering from air raids. And indeed, the Guild's work was recognised in that respect by an OBE awarded at the end of the war to Cecily Cook, who was the General Secretary. Now, you might think, well, all those things are fine and very worthy, but that doesn't prove that they're pacifists. And there's a point there in the sense that there were other organisations like the Women's Voluntary Service, for example, who were doing those kind of things. And I think, the picture there of an air raid shelter and people providing tea and coffee and things, that probably is the Women's Voluntary Service doing that. And the Women's Voluntary Service, they supported the war. They did that because they wanted to keep up the people's morale as a way of fighting back, etc. But if we look carefully at what the Guild were doing, they were deliberately not supporting the war effort, but they were, as Mrs. Rydar says at the bottom there, trying to give succour, as in help, support to the victims of war. So if you look at the second bullet point, provided entertainment and comfort for wounded soldiers. That's who they targeted. They weren't trying to just raise the morale of troops as they went off to fight. They were interested in the victims of war, and they saw the soldiers as one of the primary victims of the war. So they were very keen to help them. Helping evacuated families. The Guild was absolutely adamant that they were not going to help with the government's implementation of its evacuation policy. However, when the government had undertaken that policy, and in the view of the Guild made a mess of it, they then stepped in. They then went to the families and provided help for them, managed to provide toys for the children, comfort for the mothers who were missing their children, and so they did help then in the evacuated families after, but they were adamant that they weren't going to be involved in the process of evacuation, just in tying up the loose ends at the end, if you like. Okay, so that's why this kind of humanitarian work, as was often done by, say, the Quakers as well in the same kind of way, was not supporting the war, but supporting the victims of war, and they made that as a very clear distinction. Again, lots written about the Quakers in this kind of situation and the work they did. Lots written perhaps about the Women's Voluntary Service who supported the war, but not much written about what the WCG did in this respect. As well as, just excuse me, Ron. As well as supporting people practically on the ground, the WCG also got involved in political campaigns. One of those was a campaign about famine relief in Europe. In the parts of Europe occupied by the Nazis, which obviously was most of Europe at that time, the Allies, the British and Americans, they aimed to blockade supplies coming into Nazi-occupied Europe to try to put pressure on the Nazis, to leave those countries and to weaken their war effort. The effect of that, possibly unintended, was that many ordinary people, particularly in Greece and also in Belgium, were on the brink of starvation. And indeed, several thousand people in Greece did die, through famine during the 1940s. One of the main there's lots of literature about this, but again, it focuses on the important individuals, people like Vera Brittain, who we mentioned before, people like Edith Pye, a prominent Quaker. And also, if you look very carefully at that picture, you probably can't see the writing at the top. Oxfam comes out of this as well. The Oxford Famine Relief Committee, set up to relieve famine in Greece in the 1940s, later becomes the Oxfam organisation. All that is well documented, but what's less well documented is what the Guild did to try and put pressure on the government. So they wrote, directly to Winston Churchill, asking him to alleviate the blockade on several occasions. They backed it up in practical ways by knitting for the people of Europe, providing garments for them, and we'll come back to that point on the next slide as well. And also they wrote to the British government asking them to take on more Jewish refugees when stories start to filter out in 1942, 1943 that there are atrocities being committed by the Nazis. Not all people in Britain kind of took those stories seriously, but the Guild did, and they did actually try to do something about it there as well. Let's check on the time. I mentioned before about the knitting programme, and now the Women's Cooperative Guild had a long tradition of perhaps taking their knitting to meetings to a large extent. Knitting was one of the sort of main home crafts done by women at the time, particularly married women. And this was very much part of the Guild's tradition, probably going back to the 1880s when it was founded. So in World War II, they undertake a massive knitting campaign, which ends up producing 1 million garments. Is commended by the British government, for the work they've done there. And again, I think some historians have got the wrong end of the stick on this. They assume that they were simply knitting for the British troops, knitting, sort of warm clothing for them. Now, to some extent, in the early years of the war, yes, some of them were, and there's no doubt about that. But certainly from 1944 onwards, once the Allied invasion of Europe started to reveal some of the hardship, that the occupied peoples have been suffering. So from 1944 right through to about 1948, really, the Women's Cooperative Guild produced these millions of garments, and a lot of them are sent to the ordinary German people. Okay, not so much to the Greeks and the Belgians this time. They actually want to help the ordinary German people. And again, I think this is part of that kind of pacifism, that they feel, well, okay, we have had a war against you, but now the war is over or almost over, and we want to now sort of re-establish good relationships with you. And one way of doing that was to send them garments. And you can see from the quotations on the second half of the slide there about how grateful many of the German women were. Tears of joy and gratitude, thanks and warm Christmas greetings, etc. More than grateful for the baby shawls that had been sent. So they were all independent observers who recorded the German women sending their thanks to the British Guild's women. And like I said before, this wasn't just about providing the physical help, and like I put at the end of the first bullet point there, this was about emotional warmth as well as physical warmth. They were trying to get that kind of reconciliation between the British and German people. The mayor of Berlin, as you can see there, who was a woman herself, that she told the British Guild that she valued the moral help as much as the material help. And it was really good for the German people as they started to rebuild at the end of the war, to have signs of friendship in other countries. When a German delegate attended the National WCG conference in 1947, she got a very warm reception. And then, particularly of note, were two Guild branches in Hastings and Jersey, which had both really been on the receiving end of the German war effort in the war. Hastings is on the south coast, so it was very much within the reach of the German V1 and V2 rockets, towards the end of World War II, and it got bombarded quite heavily. Jersey, being one of the Channel Islands, was actually occupied by the Germans, and and not always, often in a very heavy-handed way. Despite that, those two branches made a massive effort to provide, to knit and to provide clothing and blankets, etc., for the German people. So again, very strong feelings of reconciliation coming across there. I think just to start to bring this together now, I think what all this shows in some ways is something about where, if you like, the feminist struggle stands in the sort of 1940s, particularly amongst the working class women of Britain. So if you look at what we've been talking about there, particularly the knitting project, you can see that, yes, it's a typical what you might call gendered response. Women knit, okay? So if women want to try, if working class women want to try and change the world in the 1940s, they get out the knitting needles. And it's that very, in some ways that very much limits the possible contribution of women in the eyes of the world. However, I think what does come across as well is the women of the Guild being very assertive in terms of their position within the wider cooperative movement and indeed wider British society. Because, like we said before, the cooperative movement in general came towards supporting the war. However, the Women's Guild stuck to, stuck to their guns, that's the wrong expression, isn't it? They stuck to their beliefs, they stuck to their principles of their pacifist policy. And therefore, I think, really showed that assertiveness, that agency, that independence of thought there. Even to the extent that there were some cooperative employers, largely men, who actually tried to discriminate against conscientious objectors in World War II. And the women's section challenged that and were very critical of that particular policy. So it does show an element, yes, of working class women doing roles which would be expected of them traditionally, the knitting, but through that policy, as part of their general pacifism, they are asserting themselves against the men, possibly even the men in their own household to a large extent, and doing things their own way. To conclude, what I think the story of the Women's Cooperative Guild shows us about the 1940s and World War II. I think, first of all, I would say that it does show that they had the organisation had a consistent policy of, as they put it, helping the victims of aggression. So they did lots of practical things to help people who had lost their homes and having to live in air raid shelters, to help wounded soldiers, to help the people of Germany who had lost so much in the war, back with the knitting policy after the war. So in all those ways, there was a consistent policy there of not supporting the aims of the war, but in helping those who'd suffered from it. And I think the fact that there was such a large organisation of several tens of thousands of people, it was never lower than 50,000, even in the height of the war, who were part of the WCG. It shows that there's quite a big challenge there to this idea of consensus, that everybody, supported the war and wanted Britain to win, etc. I think there's a different point of view there, which is very strong, not just amongst, the upper class intellectuals like Virginia Woolf and Frances Partridge, but amongst many working class women as well. And and that's the same point mentioned there in the third point in some ways, that it's not just a small number of privileged intellectuals who are challenging the war, that this is a much wider and deeper element of society as well, where you see this happening. And I think certainly one thing that I would say from my own research over the last couple of years on this is that it shows to us the importance of, when we are studying World War II or any other aspect of history, we need to go beyond the traditional historical sources. Sometimes, we need to get out of London and actually come up to places like Salford and Manchester and sort of see what the archives up here are telling us as well, because they give us a wider picture of what was actually happening there. So on that note, basically my sort of final point would be, let's keep going to places like the Cooperative Heritage records in the archives there in Manchester. And let's keep coming to the Working Class Movement Library in Salford and providing that wider picture of history. Okay, thank you. Right, thank you. So there is time for questions, and I think I've agreed with Belinda that what we'll do is we'll ask people in the studio audience first, as it were, if there's any questions here, which I will take and then report back what the question is and try to answer it. And then we'll hand over to Belinda, who will look at any questions in the chat. So if anybody who's at home or elsewhere watching this, and you have a question, if you want to type it in the chat, I think is the best way to do that. Belinda will pick it up, and in a few minutes we'll then sort of feed that through to me. Okay, from there. Yes. Okay. Right. Are there any questions in the audience, in the studio audience, as it were? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Lindsay, please. Yeah. Thanks.
So we have quite a lot on the magazine and Women's Outlook, you know, the
Yes.
public property archive. Is there much to do with this, what you're talking about in there? I know you mentioned the positive news.
Right, yeah, so Lindsay was asking if anybody didn't pick that up about another journal called the Women's Outlook, which was probably a more kind of popular, sort of down-to-earth, more like a magazine than a journal in some ways, you know, for the Women's Cooperative Guild. I must admit that that's something I've yet to look at, but I imagine I would find a similar story in there. So far, my research has been confined mainly to the Women's Cooperative, to the Cooperative News Journal, with a slightly more formal kind of representation. But yes, I will certainly have a look at the Women's Outlook as well, and see what that sort of comes up with too. And might be enough material there for another talk, perhaps in a year's time as well, on the subject matter of that. Yeah. So yes, I'm fairly sure, you know, to answer Lindsay's question, that we would find similar examples of applied pacifism, if you like, you know, through that journal as well. But that's something I've yet to look at in detail anyway. Okay, thank you. Anything else from in here? Yes, please.
Well, I was going to just comment that my mother was a very active cooperator, but one of the things that I'd not made the connection with the co-op with, but I'm sure there was one, was that quite a young child, I remember her knitting squares, and then from those, she did a lot of knitting anyway. Yes. But so the end bits that she made us a cardigan one, the end bits ended up as a square. Right. And then eventually she sort of made that into a blanket. Yes, yes, sent it on somewhere. So right, good. I hadn't realised the possible connection with the co-op.
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, right, so thanks. So a member of the studio audience here has talked about her mother, who was in the guild in the 1940s, and said that, you know, she remembers her actually doing some knitting, and probably hadn't perhaps realised the purpose of that knitting and where it would end up. But knitting in squares basically was the sort of main mode of operation, and that obviously probably would go to form blankets and things eventually. Yeah. Okay, right. Thank you. Right, I'll go over to Belinda then, if you want to perhaps feed anything through from the chat then, please.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I hope everybody can hear me. First of all, thank you very much. It was absolutely brilliant talk. And I obviously totally agree with you about making sure that people use local archives, including the library and the Cooperative Archive as well. They've got a couple of questions on the chat. First was from Melissa, who didn't quite catch how many people you said were members during World War II. Could you just repeat that for us, please?
Yes, certainly. The figure goes up and down, actually. So certainly at the start of World War II, it's 87,000, you know, to the nearest 1,000 anyway. It then fluctuates quite a bit during the war years, but at its lowest point, I think it's something like 51,000. So the figure during the war years, it fluctuates between 51,000 and 87,000. Historians have then disagreed on the reasons why that may have happened. I think, say, Gillian Scott, for example, you know, the one who's written the main book on this topic, suggests that it is because people deserted the movement because they did not agree with the leadership's pacifist policy and they wanted to support the war. Other people have suggested that it was more to do with the practicalities of war. Of course, particularly, you know, if there would have been literally hundreds of guilds in the London area, which was under, you know, fairly constant bombardment in the early years of the war. And it's very difficult then to hold meetings, you know, in those kind of circumstances. And many people then would have drifted away. Many of those women, you know, may have actually ended up sort of working in factories, being even busier than they were before, and didn't really have the time to take part in the guild activities. So certainly I think I favour that view, that a lot of the losses of the membership during the war were due to practical reasons, if you like, rather than ideological reasons. Even so, I would say that even if we say, even if it is at its most pessimistic, the idea that maybe 30-odd thousand women left the Guild because they didn't support its pacifist policy, there were still 51,000 who did, and that's a decent sized number. So, in other words, more than half of the women stayed with the organisation, and presumably, generally, in support of its kind of pacifist policy.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And there's another question here from Helen about the geographical spread of the WCBG branches and the work they did during World War II. Is there much evidence in the minute books that you've looked at that could help with this?
Yes, the minute books I've had a chance to look at so far were mainly in the kind of Manchester area, but I know other historians, if I can put myself in that category, have also looked at minute books across, say, other parts of the north of England and the south of England as well. The evidence from the Cooperative Journal seems to be a very widespread situation. So in Scotland, for example, as well, there's I think a slightly separate organisation, but still with strong links to the Guild, they seem to be just as active in their kind of pacifism as the ones in England were as well. So certainly examples from across the country are certainly prevalent in the Cooperative Journal. Yeah.
Another question about individual branch minutes as well. So have you looked at individual branch minutes? Have you been able to do that?
Yes, and it is interesting there, because in fact that was the first thing I looked at before I looked at the Cooperative Journal, and it varies quite a bit. You know, some branches. In some branches, it's sometimes hard to see from the minutes that there's actually a war happening. It's almost like, you know, day-to-day events seem to kind of take over. I remember reading one set of branch minutes, and it was in fairly kind of old-fashioned stylized handwriting, so it was quite difficult to decipher. And I was looking for any kind of signs of some kind of peace movement going on in this branch. And at one point, I thought I'd read the sentence, Mrs. Smith said she was going to resign from the Peace Committee. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is the kind of thing I'm looking for. So I read on and couldn't really find anything else about peace. Then when I kept reading onto the next page, I realised that actually she'd resigned from the Picnic Committee, not the Peace Committee. Okay, and I'd misread this. And it did seem in some of the minutes that picnics were more important than peace activism at that particular point. However, you do, certainly the stories of providing entertainment for wounded troops, for example, that comes across from a lot of the branch minutes there as well. So the kind of events that they did and the way they helped the evacuated people, the way that they helped out in air raid shelters, that is mentioned in the branch minutes as well as in the journal. Yeah.
There is one practical question from Lois, who wants to know whether or not the knitting wool was rationed. Oh, right,
that's a very good question. I would say, yeah, I would say not. I've got. I'm just going to pause and ask a member of the audience here who seems to. No, we don't think it was. I assume. Because we have plenty of sheep in this country, that probably we didn't necessarily need to. We didn't really need to import too much wool. Would be my sort of guess there. Well, that's a very good question, really. Yeah, but I would guess not from what we know. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions from the chat, unless anybody has anything else they'd like to add. I have a question myself, if that's okay. So you made a very brief sort of mention of it quite early on in the talk about the shift from sort of looking at from a maternal lens, yes, to more of a political lens, yes, and why that might have been. And do you think there's any? I mean, this is just a thought, really, but is there any case that it might have been the experiences of women or working class women during World War I or just after that might have, yes, been the reason for that shift? And is there any evidence that you've seen to that effect?
Yeah, it's hard. It's something I'm still trying to explore and get my own head around. I think yes, I think to some extent it is experiences of World War One, and I think this is my own kind of theory, my own kind of working theory at the moment. Anyway, let's say. I think before World War One, you have in this country, and indeed across many other European countries, you have a women's suffrage movement. So the suffragettes, for example, very active in the decade and a half before World War One. And I think there was a lot of women linked to the idea of feminist, female suffrage and pacifism. So in other words, they felt that once women got the vote, that that automatically, women being less aggressive than men, that wars would cease. You know, once women actually have a majority and can actually, you know, vote out aggressive politicians, and maybe women themselves become politicians and world leaders, wars would cease to happen. Now, what you then, there's two factors then. Obviously, by the 1930s, women in this country, and most countries by that stage, they do have the vote. Women are the majority of the electorate by the 1930s, and yet the world is still facing war. So that kind of idea that enfranchising women would automatically lead to peace was starting to fade. I think also you see this in the suffragette movement itself, and even within the Pankhurst family, you see quite a big split in World War One. The younger daughters, Adela and Sylvia, became pacifist. The elder daughter, Christabel, and the mother, Emmeline, became not just supporters of the war in World War One, but ardent supporters of the war. And Emmeline Pankhurst is on record as saying that she thought, you know, Germany should be crushed forever. It was a very kind of militaristic and sort of patriotic, if you like, statement from her. So again, any idea that women were automatically more pacifist, I think, had started to wane by the 1930s. And you do have people, I mentioned somebody called Helena Swanwick earlier. She observes this, and she said that she'd believe that before World War One, she thought that women were naturally more pacifist. But then by the end of World War One, she could see no difference really between men and women in terms of how militaristic or pacifist they might be. So I think it's the experiences of World War One in that sense, which I think then start to break that link between feminism and pacifism, you know, by the 1930s.
Thank you. We've got a question from Maddie. Maddie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, just because I think you'll do a better job of it than me?
I'm not sure if that's true or not. I was just thinking as you were talking, and it was so interesting, by the way, thank you, about some of the crossover basically with research that I do into the secularist and the humanist movements. And there is a lot of crossover obviously with the cooperative movement and Holyoake himself as well. But I know that they also, and some of the women in those movements used similar arguments to the ones that you mentioned, that were used about women's distinctive place. But it's really interesting what you've just said, which kind of complicates that a bit, I suppose. But I guess, I was drawn to this idea of this notion of the Brotherhood of Nations being like the religion of cooperation, and whether you've seen in the research that you've done, I guess, whether religiousness or lack of religiousness plays much of a role in there, or if
Yes.
Or if it doesn't.
Certainly amongst the guild, the guild members, occasionally you do see one or two, in the letters pages, for example, you do see one or two remarks which are quoting from the Bible, perhaps to support an argument about pacifism. But generally speaking, with the guild, it is the more economic and political arguments that prevail, I think. Now, obviously, interestingly, with other groups I've looked at, particularly obviously the Quakers, and actually a lot of the younger women who actually became conscientious objectors. In other words, as people may know, in 1941, women were called up to the armed services or the auxiliary armed services, or to work in industry on a compulsory basis. many refused and became conscientious objectors. So women became COs for the first time in the 1940s. And many of those, and they were mainly people for various reasons who were aged in their 20s, quite young women who were first to be called up. And amongst their reasons for conscientious objection, religion is often cited quite strongly, and that's something I did really notice. Because you think when you study Tudor history or even 19th century history, religion is very important there, but not often in 20th century history. But certainly as a motivation for pacifism in general, I think you do find religion being stronger in the mid-20th century than we might have expected it to be. However, amongst the guilds, although, like I say, there's some reference to it, I think it's still those economic ideas of cooperation between nations which prevail there. Right, thank you.
Okay, one final shout out for any more questions.
Oh, sorry, we've got one in the audience here.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay, right, thank you. Yeah.
No, well, it's not so much a question as I'm just looking back. My mother got married the week before war broke out. She was a librarian, which meant she had to lose her job.
Yes.
She couldn't work as a married woman.
Yeah.
And there was no change of, suddenly the war came in, oh yes, we'll have the women back. So I think that's why she got involved in the co-op as a woman guildsman, because really, that was something to do. And I mean, it's just when you look back on it and realise that anybody who worked for local government couldn't be working as a married woman.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, okay. So it was, in case people didn't hear that, the question from the audience here was more of a kind of, again, reflection on the lady's mother, saying that she kind of lost her job at the start of the war because she got married, and in many kind of jobs in those days, you had if you did get married, for example, if you were a librarian or a teacher, you did actually have to give up your job. And then her mother then joined the cooperative movement, to give her something to do, something active to do in that sense. So quite an interesting point. It is interesting on that note that, yes, certainly at the start of the war, as it had been before World War II, and I'm thinking, I know particularly about the teaching profession, that women had to give up their jobs if they got married. Of course, that changed in 1944. And from 1944 onwards, for the first time, women can remain as teachers if they get married, and in other professions as well. And the main reason for that is simply the shortage. There's so many men have gone away to fight that there's a desperate shortage then, and so they call the married women back in to actually do the teaching or the librarianship or whatever it might be. Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Thanks, Belinda.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions then. So just to finish, thank you all for attending. Thank you to Jane and Lindsay for setting up in the library, because we wouldn't have been able to do the talk today unless they'd agreed to do that. So thank you very much. And Lindsay has just posted a link to the page on our website where you can donate. Obviously, these talks are free, but we do encourage donations as well. There isn't an Invisible Histories talk next week, but our next activity is actually going to be at the Eagle Inn in Salford. We're having a symposium to celebrate the 90th anniversary of the mass trespass on the 21st of April. So on our